Today we're going to be talking about designing with intent, specifically looking at motivations that drive projects. Okay, so let's jump into it. So whenever we kind of jump into a project, we need to look at how we define our intent. Okay, so defining our intent, we position the bar for unintended outcomes. So what we're doing is we're providing ourselves an option for if things don't go exactly as we plan. So basically we're planning like we want this to be the outcome and we will accept X, Y, Z as also outcomes. So we look at the motivating factors for ourselves as designers, our stakeholders. So in some cases it might be business, in some cases it might be third sector industry, and our users, the people who engage with what we design. So remember, this is a really kind of amorphous way of discussing design. And I might use specific object examples here to give you an idea, but the same process is applicable to service design, situation design, all that kind of stuff. So when we're looking here, this is our kind of three-way conversation that we always have as designers. So we have our stakeholder here, so that might be the business that we're embedded in. We have our designer here, so that's kind of us, or maybe the organization that we're here, and this might be our end user. Now, we might not know who that person is yet, and we might not know who that person is yet, but we have to look at the kind of motivating factors that they all have. Now, every one in this kind of three-way conversation will have two kind of key things. They'll have internal and external factors impacting what they do. So let's take a look. Our stakeholder might have some existing systems in place. So let's say we're looking at a travel company. They would have existing booking systems or existing relationships with transport links, airlines, etc., etc. They might also have an existing organizational culture which impacts how they work. Our user might have experience with the service or the industry that we're dealing with, some existing experience. Now that might be negative experience, might be positive experience, might be limited experience, might be extensive experience. So for example, if you were designing a system for people to easily access prescription drugs, and you were designing it for a group of pharmacists, you would design that very differently than if you were designing it for a group of say, technically illiterate pensioners, right? And then the other thing to look at is the desirability. So desirability really focuses on, do they want it? Do they want the service? Or is the service a means to an end? Is the product an means to an end? Is the design something that they want? Now, desirability isn't necessarily, isn't necessarily a positive thing, or it isn't necessarily a negative thing. It's just a thing. And then we look at our designer. This is us. So this is number one. We look at our internal kind of factor as our understanding of our end user. So who that person is, and often they're different to who they think we are, or who we think they are, and our existing skill set. Our existing skill set in terms of our ability to design, project manage, seek advice, access resources, all those kinds of things, but also to understand our stakeholder. So the skill set that we might have to engage with them. So to use our travel scenario, we might only have the experience of being a customer. So we're kind of down this end of the spectrum, really. We don't have that experience of understanding it from a design perspective. Now, as well as these kind of intrinsic or internal motivators, we have external motivators too. So let's take a look. So when we're looking at our stakeholder, these are the kind of two big ones that you'll find, especially in business. We'll look at market pressure. So market pressure isn't necessarily about competition. It's often about not feeling like you're being left behind. So an example of this might be where we see a company like McDonald's bringing out, say, a vegan burger. Let's use that example. Now, a company like Burger King might go, "Oh, all right, well, we don't have any data to suggest that a vegan burger is going to sell, but what we don't want is the vegan killjoy in the group of friends telling their friends they can't go to Burger King because they don't have any options for them, and they have to go to McDonald's because they have the options for them." So, we're not trying to compete, but what we're trying to do is we're buckling to market pressure. The market is kind of suggesting that we might need this thing. We don't think we do, but we're doing it because the market says so. And then, of course, we have budgets. So budgets, specifically focus on things like cash flow and money, but they might also look at things like access to workforce, retention of workforce, things like that. Let's take a look. Oh dear, Fion's covering up my little screen here. Then we have our external factors for our end user. So we have cultural pressure. So that might be kind of based on religion or belief system or political allegiance, but it might also be based on subcultural pressure or kind of friendship group pressure. So this idea of someone being pressured to access something from a cultural perspective. So if we all remember at the very beginning of lockdown 1, I always think that is like lockdown classic back in March, how everybody downloaded House Party. Everyone downloaded House Party, everyone used it like 5 times and everyone stopped using it. There was cultural pressure at the time to download House Party. We see the same thing every Thursday night at 8 o'clock. Everyone felt pressure to go outside and clap for who? Maybe the NHS, maybe someone else. We don't really know. Does that make a difference to the NHS? No. Does that make us feel better? Maybe. So look at our cultural pressures there. And then this last one is quite interesting, looking at access. So access to the service, the product, etc., access to the piece of design. So there's lots of things that might limit access. There might be things like money, so people might not be able to afford it. There might be proximity, so maybe the service or product, etc., is located within a different geographical area, a different area that they can't access. So that might be online, for example, and if you are unable to access things digitally, then you're unable to access the service. But it might also have to do with things like literacy. So not just physical literacy or being able to read, but things like visual literacy or numeracy issues. People relating to understanding language might have an impact there. I know, we spoke last week a lot about this idea of use of plain English and use of kind of accessible language. This is a big impact for end users. Oh, bloody hell, Fion. Okay, there we go. And then looking at external impacts on designers, we have our resources. Now that might be about skill set, manpower, money. And then the big motivating factor for us is something like time. So how much time we have to produce a project, how much time we have to roll out a project. Is it too much time? Is it not enough time? So we can see we're looking at our kind of design intent, our motivating factors to design. We have to look at all of these things all at once. Now, it's not enough for us to just think about it from this perspective. We have to jump into that headspace and jump into that headspace as well. So, there's a whole position, user experience designer, UX designer is a big, growth job in the design industry, and it's looking primarily at end user, about how users experience primarily software and things like that. But it's a kind of key thing to think about, that we can't just be this person. We can't just sit ourselves in the designer seat and think that we know everything. Okay. The next thing to think about when we're looking at our design intent is how will the project be produced? So I'll go through lots of these. There's a few of these. Now, all right, I get why is the mousetrap there? To be honest, I really liked it. And I thought there was some fun little 3D graphics that I just chucked in because I enjoyed the way they look. But a mousetrap is a really great example of a really good piece of design. It's very simple. It does its job. It's easy to use. It's intuitive, so users can understand it very easily, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we have to first look at rollout. So how will the project be rolled out? So will the project, for example, be trialed and then tested full scale? Will it go straight to full scale production? What are we going to do to kind of roll this thing out? What is it that we need as designers to make sure that we can test and measure the success of this project? Next is look at communication. So how will the project be communicated? So how will it be communicated to our stakeholder? How will it be communicated to our end user? How will that internal and external communication happen? So for example, you've probably got a better chance of success of a project if you have strong internal buy-in. So let's say you're working in the retail sector and you communicate a new sales drive to sell socks. you've got probably a better chance of people wanting to sell more socks, wanting to push that product, if you kind of connect them to the idea that those socks, every single sock sold goes to help, I don't know, an orphan donkey or something. But the idea of telling someone that something's going to happen makes them feel a lot more comfortable about the thing happening. How will the project be manufactured? So in this case, when we talk about kind of object design, we need to talk about, supply chain management and, project management and manufacturing. But in terms of, say, something like a service design, we need to see how that service will be manufactured, put into action. Then we're looking at testing. So how will we test what we're producing? So do we test it pre full-scale rollout? How do we manage the small-scale testing? All those different kinds of things. How will we get feedback? So will there be feedback from end user? Will there be feedback from stakeholders? How will that take place? Is it anonymous surveys? As we all know from looking at things like TripAdvisor and Google and all those kinds of things, we're probably not going to get the real kind of feedback if we make it totally anonymous and totally random. Similarly, if we flip the script on that, and if you're a retail worker and you're feeding back to your manager about how well a project's going, you're probably not likely to say it's going very badly. Okay. Then we look at our next kind of driver for intent, and it's how will the project fit into existing systems? Fun little piece of DNA there. It's like all those little systems working together. Okay, well, I think that worked. So in order to understand how our project will fit into an existing system, we need to define that existing system, trying to map it as much as we possibly can to understand it fully. The next thing for us to do is to understand skill sets in terms of our stakeholders. So when we're looking at skill sets, we're not necessarily referring to physical skills necessarily, but it might be things like comprehension. So the likelihood of someone who has never encountered television before being able to understand the concept of a webinar is pretty minimal. Minimal. So understanding the kind of skill sets of your stakeholders are important. So you can easily see, as designers, we can look from the outside and we can see how a suitcase manufacturer could use the skills of a skateboard manufacturer. Great, good set of wheels, chuck it on a suitcase, carry whatever you want. We can see that from the outside, but I imagine if your whole life has been spent making suitcases, you're probably not that aware of skateboard wheel technology. So understanding their skill sets is really important to map the ecosystem. The same as when we're looking at our users. So do the users have anything that's stopping them from accessing our service or system or product? What is stopping them from accessing the service or system or product? What is it they're able to do? What is it that they can able to be encouraged to do? So, and kind of an anecdotal example is I bought my dad a smartphone a couple of years ago, last year, year before, actually now, 2019. And, when he was, when I was growing up, he was a very fast typer. Type like 100 words a minute. Loved typing, had a typewriter, very noisy, all those kinds of things. Get him on a smartphone and WhatsApp, and he just couldn't deal with it. Couldn't deal with predictive text. Hated it. Didn't want to be told what to do. All those kind of things. Just absolutely rejected the smartphone totally. Now, if I'd introduced it in a different way, perhaps that would be a different outcome. But his skill set didn't allow him to kind of understand that process. A person who's perhaps grown up with a smartphone, your generation, for example, your skill set in engaging with that, probably takes into account some period of adjustment. So we also need to look at our existing resources and our existing resource systems. So in the case of product design, great, good to see that's come up. In the case of product design, we might look at raw materials through to manufacturing resources and all those kinds of things. Okay, our next driver. Can the project be adapted through use? Now we'll talk specifically about the reading that we looked at the other day, but it's important to think about this, that once a product is kind of out in the market, it has to be used. And once it's being used, things will happen and adjustments might need to be made. So let's take this as a little example. So you can see on the screen here, in fact, I'll move Fion so I can do this a bit better. Sorry, Fion. Okay, so you can see on the screen, I have a fun little box Okay, and we've had to put a handle on the box. Pretty cool. So what we need to do is decide how to measure the box to get the handle on it. So we have two options. Do we? Oh, damn it. Option 1. Do we match the center of the handle, so this line here, for example, with the center of the box? Or do we measure from the edge of the box to the edges of the handle to get it right? Now, one of those options allows the box to change shape. So, for example, if we, probably should, how do I go back? I don't know. There we go. If we do this one, the box can grow that way and can grow that way, and this will always be in the center. All right, so that's a good piece of design. If we do it the other way, the box can't grow because then the handle will be out of place. So it's important for us to think about how our object or our product or our service can be adapted through use, because we might need to change it. So what we don't want is to have to go right back to the drawing board and redesign the entire thing. So that's this idea of designing in potential change. So the idea that it might have to change in response to feedback. We also need to look at this idea of responding for unintended use. There's so many things around the world that were designed for one use and then used for another. Tissues, for example, were first designed as gas mask filters in the First World War. Listerine was designed as an antiseptic. Bubble wrap was designed as a wallpaper. Play-Doh was designed as a wallpaper cleaning tool. You know, all these things were designed for different uses, and because of their unintended uses, they were used for different things. Have you guys ever heard of a brand called Kotex? It's a big brand in America. They make like sanitary pads and things like that. But Kotex was first designed, or sanitary pads were first designed as wound coverings for soldiers in the First World War. And all the nurses that were using them were like, these are pretty absorbent things. They're pretty useful. And suddenly, post-World War I, they changed their use. And it's the idea of being able to respond to that, to kind of pivot your ideas, which really is significant in kind of developing your intent. Looking at adapting to new systems. Okay. I didn't really mention much about that. Looking at adapting to new systems. So do you augment existing systems? Do you design new systems? Do the systems adapt as a response to your users, for example? Or do we have to develop new systems because of our stakeholders or because what's currently existing doesn't work? So this is the paper that I gave you guys, the Manifestations of Everyday Design, Guiding Goals and Motivations. And it looked at motivations and intent of everyday design. So everyday design explores how designed objects and systems are developed to serve a specific purpose, and those things are often repurposed or hacked to serve an unintended purpose. Now, the paper itself talks about IKEA hacks quite a bit, but there's a fantastic website on IKEA hacks, which I would recommend you guys checking out. There's lots of kind of hacker communities out in the world where people use things in a different way. There's a great YouTube series specifically about an American guy who's trying to build a Tesla, and he keeps buying up all smashed up Teslas and repurposing to build a new Tesla, because I don't know if you know this, but Tesla won't allow you to repair your vehicle. So just like Apple, they have proprietary, they have kind of restrictions on who can buy parts, who can access tools, all those kinds of things. So it's interesting to see how people kind of start to get around these systems. There's actually a lot of acts going through Parliament or have been passed, certainly in Europe, called the Right to Repair Act. And there's one specifically going in now for John Deere or International Harvester or Cat tractors, which are about that farmers have the right to repair their own vehicles. People have the right to repair their own phones, etc., etc., etc. But anyway, let's take a look at this. So we looked at those three categories: families, hobbyist jewelers, and steampunks. If you haven't read the paper, please do. I won't necessarily go into super detail about the paper, so it's worth jumping in and looking at. So then we looked at these these motivations were drawn out of the paper. So the first motivator is to create something beautiful. Now, for a lot of you who are kind of have a background in product design or background in kind of image design, this is where you are a lot of the time. So to create something that is aesthetically appealing and allowing us to express emotion. So in this way, the intent of the designer must be to communicate an emotion. So that's either to communicate emotion themselves or to enable the user to communicate an emotion. Right? Now, in the case of something like jewelry design, you might wear a specific crown that would communicate how you felt that day. It's an odd choice of an accessory, but there you go. Next, we look at this idea of creating something meaningful. Now, this is a little bit less tangible than the last one we looked at. So embedding meaning into design moves beyond the final outcome and connects the system to the process of creation. So what we're looking at here is that the designer, their intent is to enable an act of creation. Now, this is a lot less difficult than you might think. If you think about this idea of creating a set of paint, what you're doing there is you're not creating a set of paint, you're creating the artwork that the user will create. Yeah, so your intent is to enable an act of creation. You're making it simple to do. The same as producing, say, a series of interpretive dance steps that a child or a group of children can put together in their own way to make their own dance. That's a simple way of doing that. The next motivator that we looked at in that article is this idea of shaping the world to suit yourself. So to suit the user. We kind of perhaps think about this as the basic tenet of design, that altering the world to suit our needs as humans is what design is all about. And we do this in a way ourselves as humans, and as designers, we augment the world in a physical way, in a digital way, all the time. So we consume specific food, we purchase specific clothing, we connect to different media, and in this way, we move the world around. So the intent of the designer, oh dear, Stephen, must be develop an augmentable system. So the idea that a system can be altered or is designed specifically to be altered. So we might call this idea world building. So if you think of this idea in, say, software development, so let's take Minecraft, for example, that's one that the kids love, is that's specifically the point of that game. So you might be mixing two motivators here. So the first one is that kind of might be the act of creation that we just looked at. And the second one might be this, to create a world. So the act of creation is about kind of the creation, the process, the creativity going into the process, the activity of producing. And this one might be to produce an outcome which suits that person. Okay. Or we might look at a very pragmatic thing and that idea of achieving existing goals. So mostly when we look at design, it's kind of this. It's, oh, well, I've got to solve a problem. Here's my problem. It's all about pragmatism, all about solving the end goal, even in the immediate or short term. I have cold feet. I need to design shoes to keep my feet warm. That is it. Right. But what we don't look at in something like that, as that super quick example, is that having warm feet will allow us to travel to the next village to speak to someone. Make friends, show them how to make shoes, etc., etc., etc. So this idea of achieving a short goal is about small systems thinking. Fiona, did you take a photo of the screen then, like a weirdo? Okay. So the intent in this context of the designer must be to either understand the goal and develop systems to achieve it more effectively, or to develop a system that can evolve to achieve multiple outcomes. So for example, we take something like a writing goal or developing a writing system. Writing systems are developed to communicate really simple things. How many cows you're going to buy, which way to water, very simple things like that. But actually, they develop into systems that can solve, they can achieve multiple outcomes. Oh dear, what have I just done? Okay. So think of this idea of AI and algorithms as a driver for this. That you click on one thing on Netflix, suddenly you're shown 5 other things. One day you go onto the New Balance website and you look at a pair of New Balance 720s in sky blue because you really like them and they're 25 quid at the moment. And then suddenly every single day for the next 10 years, you've got ads for New Balance shoes in all of your news feeds. So that's what happens. That's this. It's AI and algorithms kind of changing and altering to achieve that short-term goal of making you buy things. So when we're looking at all of these motivators, we need to figure out how we can actually measure them. How do we measure the outcome of success of our design intervention? That's a really tricky one. That's one we're going to spend the entire term really tackling. How can we ensure that the outcome we're measuring is impacted by the intervention? This is really, really key and really important. So often we connect this idea of, we find an outcome and we connect it to our intervention. We take the current coronavirus crisis. The government can pick can do some kind of intervention, and then a few weeks later say, yep, this is what caused that intervention. So we see this thing happening a lot. Everyone's saying, well, it's kids spreading the coronavirus at home. They go to school, they don't socially distance, and they go home and they spread the coronavirus. And probably that's not the only thing. It might be the relaxing of rules before Christmas, then the tightening just before Christmas, then the relaxing at Christmas, then the relaxing after Christmas, tightening again. It might be confusion that's caused that increase in infection. So there's lots of things here that we might say, oh, are they connected? Are they not? So here's a few examples that we need to be looking at. We need to look at multiple longitudinal studies. Now, longitudinal testing is testing that goes for a long time. So testing before we do our intervention, testing whilst the intervention is happening, and testing post-intervention will allow us to understand what impact that intervention had. Hypothesizing is a good idea. So before we even get to the intervention, hypothesizing about what we think the outcome might be, what we intend the outcome to be, what the measurable for that outcome might be, and then testing your hypothesis as many times as possible before you move into the project. The next one is looking at defining. So defining what success might mean. So success doesn't necessarily need to be massive. It could be incremental. It could be, it could be no change or no negative change, for example, could be defined as success. Questioning. So questioning as many people, as many participants, as many engagers, as many users, as many stakeholders as possible about how your possible intervention might work. So these things here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, well, actually at least the first 4 are ones that I want you to take into the projects that we do every week. All right, so defining, questioning, hypothesizing, all those kinds of things. Now, as I said last week, and as I'll keep saying all the time, correlation is not causation. So that statement basically says that just because something is happening at the same time as something else, it doesn't mean it's causing it. All right, so let's take, for example, I don't know, Wales is going to play rugby. They go on the pitch and lightning strikes the stadium. Then Wales loses. Now, probably Wales lost because they didn't play well, and probably not because lightning struck the stadium. So just because those things happen at the same time doesn't mean that one is the cause of the other. So there are 2 examples that I absolutely love that I want to talk to you guys about in relation to intent not working out very well. So the first one is the Cobra Effect, or the Cobra's effect, and the next one is the Thomas Midgley unintended consequences. So what I might do is stop sharing my screen, talk to you guys about that, and then we'll jump into the brief that I'm about to show you. So let me give you a second here. Okay, so everyone heard all that? That all came through loud and clear? Thank you. Great. Okay, so let's talk about the Cobra Effect. Now, this is potentially an apocryphal story, so not necessarily 100% true, but it illustrates the kind of idea of not understanding design intent fully and not understanding the systems in which you design fully. So you'll find lots of examples around this. They might include rats, they might include other animals, but the Cobra Effect is this. So the British government, went to, well, not the British government, but the East India Company went to India and thought, hey, this looks pretty nice. We're going to colonize India. So off they did, colonize India. They go to New Delhi and think, it's a really hot place, New Delhi, and there's lots of snakes. Too many cobras. We don't want cobras here because it's not great. They keep biting all our dogs and all our friends. So what we can do is we want to reduce the overall number of cobras. So how do we do that as a company? Well, the best thing that companies do is they incentivize people. So a company might give you a discount to buy more, for example. That's an incentivization. And this is a kind of long-held belief in economics, that people can be incentivized to do things they wouldn't normally do. So kind of encouraged or kind of paid or somehow given an outcome to do the things they wouldn't normally do. So it's not necessarily in the nature of people in New Delhi to kill snakes, but the East India Company said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to pay you for every snake you bring in. So you kill a snake, you bring in a snake, you bring in a dead snake, and we'll pay you. That worked amazingly well. So the number of cobras that were in the city, were in New Delhi at the time, dropped significantly. Let's say they dropped by 90%. Absolutely phenomenal. And the company said, okay, well, we've achieved our goal. We're going to stop the scheme now. We paid out a bunch of cash. We got rid of the cobras. We're all good. So they dusted their hands off and went about their business. And then, let's say 6 months later, they realized that the number of cobras that were in the city had increased by 150%. So we're even more than when they started the project. And basically what they found out when they did an investigation was that, well, smart people hacked the system. So instead of going in, it's much easier, instead of going into the wild to try and find cobras, it's significantly easier to just farm cobras. So if the government's going to pay you for a dead cobra, it doesn't matter whether they caught the cobra or whether you made the cobra. So there were all these amazing cobra farms, leapt up around the edges of the city. So people were breeding cobras, taking them into the city, selling them, and going back out and doing great. And when the price fell out of that market, when the company decided not to pay anymore, they just let all the cobras go, because it's pointless to keep cobras if you're not being paid. So that effect happens all the time in economics. It's just the idea that we think, oh, we're going to incentivize people to do X, Y, Z. Great, here's going to happen. People are really smart, and they're pretty crafty, so they'll do anything to try and make a buck. And when the bottom falls out of that kind of market, well, things happen. But that happens because people don't think about the systems fully. And, it happens all around the world. It happened in London with rats. So people were paid to, exterminators, rat catchers, were paid per tail. You bring in a rat tail, you get paid. Fantastic. Here's what rat catchers do. You catch a rat, you chop its tail off, you let the rat go again so it can make more rats. You take the tail in, you get paid. Next generation of rats show up, great, chop the tails off as well. Happened in Australia with rabbits. Hunters were sent out. Rabbits are a huge issue in Australia. Feral populations, biggest population in the world. Hunters were sent out to shoot rabbits. It's actually quite hot in Australia out in the bush. It's much easier to grow a bunch of rabbits, have a rabbit hutch in your backyard, and just kill them every time they have more babies. And rabbits produce really quick. So when no one wants to buy them anymore, we just let them go. That's fine. So all these ideas. Now the next person I want you to think about is a person called Thomas Medgley. Now he's a person you should definitely look at and look him up. And he's one of my favorite chemical engineers of all time. I'm not sure I have too many, but he's definitely one of them. So Thomas Medgley was a chemical engineer, and in the early days of vehicle manufacture, engines used to make this kind of knocking noise. The way that the petrol that was used in them, engines would be very noisy and they kind of break apart, so they wouldn't last very long. So Thomas Medgley thought, what additive can I put into the fuel that will stop this noise and be cheap? So he developed leaded petrol, so petrol with lead in it. Now, for those of you who are as young as you are, you probably don't know the kind of devastating impacts that lead had on people. So lead poisoning, people's lead levels in their bodies shot up, and people got lead poisoning. Thomas Medgley himself gave himself lead poisoning from doing this. This had extremely detrimental effects on the environment. The fact that burning lead was being shot out of the backs of cars every time they drove, right up until, I think, the early 2000s, was a serious thing. So he had terrible effects on the environment. He got over his lead poisoning and thought, oh my God, this is bad. I've wrecked the environment. What can I do? Okay, so at the time he thought, okay, what is it that I can do to help people? And at the time, refrigeration was very expensive, and most chemicals used in refrigeration were either very explosive or were very toxic. So he set himself moving through the periodic table, working through the table. He developed a chemical called a chlorofluorocarbon. Have you guys heard of that? Fluorine is or Freon, sorry, is the most popular one. So chlorofluorocarbons are non-toxic, non-explosive gases used in refrigeration, or they were used in refrigeration. Any things like spray deodorant, hairspray, anything like that required kind of high pressure. Now that's fantastic, and it worked great, created all these positive things. But what Thomas Midgley didn't realize, because he didn't do the testing and didn't do the longitudinal studies, is that chlorofluorocarbons cause an enormous hole in the ozone layer in the world. And so in the 1970s, up until now, there's a hole in the ozone layer, which is the Earth's protective layer over Antarctica, which is increasing environmental melting significantly. So good old Thomas Midgley, trying to, with the best of intentions, ended up ruining the world more than any other single person on Earth in history. And there's lots of these kinds of things, these kind of geoengineering things are happening all the time. And people are trying to kind of create a better world. And designers do this all the time. Just recently, you guys heard of the Australian bushfires last year? Devastating bushfires. Well, they've been found, the smoke and ash has been in the stratosphere for the last year and actually cooled the world down over the last year. So kind of halted very slightly global warming, which is great. But that's like keeping warm by burning your clothes. It's a completely insane thing to do. But a company in the US is trying to get world governments to agree to stratospheric seeding, where they would seed sulfuric particles in the stratosphere to reflect a lot of the Earth's sunlight to kind of cool the world down. Completely insane idea, completely untested, all those kinds of things. So we're looking at our ideas here. Let's wrap all this up and kind of look at our three things. One is our intent. What is we intend to do? What do we intend to do as designers? What do we intend the outcome to be? Two is understanding all of the people involved in that system. Three is understanding the system itself. How do we kind of map all of those things together? Four is really interrogating the problem to make sure that we can understand it. And five is testing it enough to try and mitigate any unintended consequences. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so I'm going to show you we've got a little brief here that I'm going to show you. It's the shortest brief ever, so it's going to require you to ask some questions, and then we'll talk about it in a second. Okay. Did anyone manage to watch my video on developing a criteria for success? Good. Okay. But you've done some work on criteria for success with Phil before? Excellent. Great. All right. So here is our brief. So COVID-19 has decimated the traditional hospitality sector. You need to save the tiny pub. So in order to do that, you need to ask questions, do some research, propose some ideas, look for loopholes, and you need to present your pitch by 6 o'clock today.